Hello, hello. Welcome to episode 2 of Power to the Diaspora. My name is Kenidi Rae. Thank you so much for coming back again. Thank you for giving me a chance and listening through those audio issues. I'm going to get better, I promise. Last time we were together, we were talking about how to end the dark ages for Black people. And we said that we were gonna figure it out together because I don't know the answer to that question. I just know that we have to do something about it. And one of the things we agreed to is that we would learn more. I wanted to tell you guys about one of the very first people I saw learn about their African heritage. This podcast is kind of named in his honor, deeply inspired by him. A dear friend of mine and probably one of the coolest and most interesting people a lot of us ever knew, Ramon Power. He is one of the first people I ever saw embody a new, more African identity. And I saw the way that he experimented and the way his journey led him into Rastafarianism. I do feel like I really watched him evolve into the person who he became. I knew him for a long time. I met him when he just started Lodge, so he would have been in first form and I was in second, and he was just a little guy, just confused, just going through life like all the rest of us. And as he found his way in his identity and his truth, his locks grew, his confidence grew, and he still was the him he always was. But I believe that he was empowered by his learning and his interest in more Afrocentric things. And I saw how that enriched him. I believe that we can look to the way that shift enhanced his life, and perhaps we can let it enhance ours as well. Now, I am again not sending everybody to become a Rasta, just like I'm not sending anybody back to Africa, just like I'm not sending anyone to do anything. I'm encouraging us to look at the ways that people have connected to our ancestors and to that time and their cultures, and maybe see what amongst those options can work for you, can apply to your life. Because the great thing about every journey, also I think the journey of identity specifically, is completely internal and it just has to fit you. My point is that there is a way for each and every one of us to connect to our ancestors and incorporate things from cultures that really are our cultures. We just don't know. And we can pick and choose what elements will empower us and make us feel closeness and safeness and connection, and we get to make those choices. It's almost like if we have the opportunity to completely understand, redefine, rewrite our history, because it's just unwritten, really, and we can decide what it is. The nature of how extreme the cultural loss was due to the trafficking of our ancestors. We have to rebuild. We don't have a choice. And because of how extreme it is, we can take many a creative liberty, I believe. Because, first of all, who's going to check you? If you feel like if you are deeply connected to a group or a culture because, I don't know, maybe you saw some art and it spoke to you, or maybe you think that a lot of the people from that particular group or place look like the people in your family, and you decide that that's your culture, then it is. Who's going to tell you otherwise? Like, and from that place, I think we can build outwards. A lot of my focus has been on the region of West Africa because that's just naturally where we're likely from. But I think honestly, the entire continent is available to your imagination, to your structuring of your ancient identity. And I think we should talk about as many of them as possible. The question I'm trying to act, or the thing I want you to think about, is what does an appreciation of your African heritage look like on you? Of course, we're Black people every day. Our skin is some shade of dark to light brown every day. But how else can you incorporate it? For me, I like a good hairstyle. I feel like one thing about ancient Africa, or even more recent, just pre the really, really bad things, that time too, is we like a good hairstyle. I think that that's one of those things that we keep culturally. It's not just the braids, it's not just the twists. I think it's all of it. So I think even the wigs, the weaves, I think hair is one of the ways we keep our ancestors alive. One of the ways we keep them close and honor their style expressions. I think that's a great way. When I was in Ghana, I wanted to get what essentially was a kimono, but in African print. And I really thought I was going to be able to just buy that, like in a store, because I had seen it on Pinterest. But I very quickly realized, oh no, this kind of is what I started to call diaspora fashion. And I think we should do a lot more of that, by the way. But I described it as diaspora fashion because on Pinterest it looked so normal. There were so many of them. But it is a kimono, but in African print. Like, how did I not figure out that that was something that we had come up with over here and not actual traditional African fashion? I don't think that everything has to be traditional. I really think that the mix and matching and the adaptation and integration of the styles is so fun. I think it's the way that fashion evolved before and that we should keep on doing it. Then, of course, there's the love of jewelry that you see in photographs of ancient African people, or not even ancient African people, even like the modern kings and royals. They are covered in jewelry. There's so many gold bangles, so many rings. And I think that our people are extravagant, beautiful, They wear art, they embody it. And when we in 2026 remember these things and we dress like that, I think we call on our ancestors. We say to them, yes, you are here. You you survived. And I walk this earth because of the things that you did. Speaking of our ancestors, I want to give you all some actual information and not just my free flowing thoughts and opinions, even though I think that's when I do my best work. But, I want you to get some actual information when you leave here too. Let's have a quick lesson on where exactly the people who ended up in the Caribbean were from. Barbadians are descended primarily from three regions, and that is the Bight of Biafra, the Gold Coast, and the Bight of Benin. However, those are not the only places that people from the Caribbean were brought from. People who ended up in the Americas generally and some of the other Caribbean islands, they were from Sierra Leone, Senegambia, parts of modern-day Central Africa, and the Windward Coast. These places are kind of just in that little curve. That little curve, if you can imagine it, at the bottom. I started to realize the part of the African coast that we were from. I found out that these used to be thriving coastal towns prior, and there would be surfing, and the people from these areas were fantastic swimmers. And then you hear people make jokes about how Black people can't swim. This is me with the yarn, but I think I'm sure I'm not the only person who came to this conclusion. I feel like I read this somewhere, or maybe I'm putting it on somebody. Yeah, maybe I'm putting this on somebody and I have a false memory that I read this, because it's a little too dark to admit that I might have thought of it myself. So I hope I didn't. But people will joke that Black people can't swim when we used to be able to, but it literally was physically dangerous to be near the ocean because you could lose your life. Like, you could get trafficked to the Caribbean, because of course they started on the coast. That was the most dangerous place to be. And then our people get trafficked across the water and put on islands. There's a lot of negative exposure to water, and I feel like that is probably why a lot of people on Caribbean islands can't swim, because by the time the people who we are directly descended from got to the Caribbean, it was known that it was dangerous to be on the coasts. Isn't that terrifying? Like I said, I hope I read that. I almost don't want this to be an original thought, but the pieces fit together really easily and seamlessly, don't you think? So yeah, we were primarily descended from people from that coast because that's where the boats landed, and it was most convenient to steal people from. Yeah. Speaking of horrible jokes rooted in terrifying and stressful truths, do y'all remember that we was Kangs Hotep period of jokes on the internet? They're saying that 2026 is the new 2016. I don't know that this is from 2016, but I feel like it was around then. Do you remember that time when anyone dared to mention the fact that there were thriving kingdoms and empires in West Africa? Some person, and sometimes that person would be a Black person, would taunt them and be like, we was Kangs, and then they would call them a hotep. I know you remember that. I feel like radicalization happens slowly over time and it pushes you without you even realizing. Because I did not know how upsetting that joke was to me. Like, it always made me uncomfortable. I hated to hear it. Also, I guess it didn't feel true, but I didn't know. I didn't know. I guess I wanted the people to be right. So even though I had no information of my own, I definitely wanted the people on the internet who were being like, Black people were kings. Like, I wanted them to be right, but I hadn't gone to a stage to do any research on my own. But I do remember that they would get called hoteps, and hotep was not a nice thing to get called. I think there was an implication that if you were a hotep, you were dumb. And like, do you see how crazy it is? Like, they're like, if you think that there were thriving kingdoms and empires in Africa, you're dumb. What? And it was, and it's true. Like, it's the part where it's true. But we were so lost in that sauce, man. At the same time, I also have to admit that the alleged hoteps, they had bad PR, man. Like, they were onto something in a lot of ways, especially read ancient Africa and the wonders of Africa and those kinds of things. But a lot of the times, people did have a habit of being off base on some other points. So I acknowledge that, I acknowledge that. But I think that the bigger point here is that we were hearing this discourse, and a lot of us, myself included, didn't immediately go look up, were Black people kings in Africa? And even when you saying that sounds stupid, like the words sound dumb. But I think at the point when you have so little information that there can be a whole theme of jokes and memes and taunts on the internet that are so wrong, I think you need to type in whatever comes to mind in Google. We can't be precious about asking the questions well. Just ask them, because it was ridiculous. It was ridiculous. Somebody should have typed that into Google. So, first things first, justice for my hoteps. We was Kangs, and it's really rude that we didn't believe them. We should do better. Let me educate you, since the hoteps were ignored. There was many a great empire in West Africa, and there were even more kingdoms and empires in Africa as a whole. But I like to keep a little focused on West Africa because it's the most relevant to the diaspora in the Americas. What really happened is control over the trans-Saharan trade routes cemented the powers of the Sudanic empires. Gold from the south was exchanged for salt from the north. We already talked about the Ghana Empire, which was active from 300 to 1100 CE and known as the Land of Gold. They functioned as the middlemen in the gold to salt trade. And we touched on the Mali Empire, which was active from 1235 to 1670 CE. One of the most famous rulers of this empire was Mansa Musa. He's still considered to be the wealthiest person to ever live. I'm sure you've heard about him and the mass inflation he caused in Egypt while he was on a pilgrimage to Mecca because he gave away so much gold. I also really enjoy the story about the previous Mansa, which is Mansa Abubakar II, who abdicated the throne and appointed Mansa Musa as his successor. We have to circle back to this one, but the short version of this story is that The previous Mansa had a need to know what lay beyond the neighboring seas, and he set off with a crew to see the world, but they never returned. And some say that the crew that left Mali landed in the Caribbean. We'll talk about it more, I promise. People often dismiss the idea that Mansa Abubakar II and his crew made it to the Americas because there isn't a smoking gun. However, there are reports from early Spanish explorers like Columbus and Balboa about seeing Black people in the Americas. And the reason I need, not want, need to circle back to this, because the second expedition left Mali 750 years ago. And they're saying, well, we don't have the wreckage of a ship or anything like DNA evidence, so we can't agree that it happened. But Spanish explorers said they saw them, and we take the word of Spanish explorers about all kinds of things. But somehow we can't get on board with the idea that there were people from Africa who arrived in the Americas before the transatlantic slave trade. Even though those same Spanish explorers said they saw Black people, right? When we do talk about this again, I think that the question I have is, why is their word good enough for some things but is not good enough for others? And the things their word isn't good enough for are things that illustrate the ability of people from the continent of Africa. Those things they need more evidence about. And then there's also the Songhai Empire, which was active from 1460 to 1591 CE. And at its peak, it was larger than Western Europe. It was centered around the city of Gao, and it was a powerhouse of administrative and military power. Another favorite of mine, the Kingdom of Benin, which was active from 1180 to 1897 CE. And this kingdom was located in modern-day Nigeria, as opposed to the modern country of Benin. This was a highly organized forest kingdom. It had sophisticated urban planning, and it is the place that the also kidnapped and displaced Benin bronzes are from. There's a fantastic story of overpowering the colonizers out of Benin. Of course, it does have a sad ending, and that's when the Benin bronzes get taken. I know that a lot of people have been looking to highlight stories of resistance, and I really enjoy that story out of Benin, but I don't want too much to focus on the colonial past, so there's that challenge, but I'm sure we'll talk about it. This has very little structure overall, so maybe we'll circle back to a few stories of resistance as well. And just to close and give y'all a teeny bit more information, some of the groups who ended up in the Caribbean were the Asante, the Awe, the Fawn, and the Fante. So far, I have explored Asante culture the most. There's so much to learn, so it wasn't hard to get caught up. I actually got so caught up that the princess in my historical fiction is an Asante princess, and the story follows her opulent day-to-day life filled with responsibility but also like leisure and pleasure. That's how caught up I got when I started to learn about the groups of people from that area. I'm going to learn a lot more about the Asante culture because that's what I know the best. I actually don't think I got any further. Yeah, I didn't get much further. I know that group the best, and we're going to talk about them. Also, I think they're the most connected to Barbados, and they acknowledge and claim us. I think that's what you have to call it. The Asantehene, the current one sitting in Asantehene, was in Barbados semi-recently, I believe he came in on an inaugural flight from Ghana. I could be wrong, but I think so. I think that's why I became so interested. Like, I almost felt like they were my people, you know? And also, it was definitely looking at people from Ghana and being like, wow, these look like people from anywhere in Barbados. And it was the pattern recognition maybe that slotted those things together for me. And then I completely locked in on the Asante people. One of the things I still have to decide if I'm doing is, will I keep the story as a story in the Asante Palace, or will I say, oh, it's inspired by Asante culture but is not a direct reference? I'm deciding what to do with that. I almost feel as though it's more impactful if it is a story about the Asante royal family. But the thing about the Asante royal family is they are in existence today, and my story is completely fictional when it comes to the characters in the story. There is fictional stories, but against a real backdrop. So I didn't want it to be possible to misconstrue, or for it to be thought that I was telling a story about one of the real people from the anti-royal family. So I'm still navigating that. I'm taking suggestions. We have now together made it to the end of episode 2. I continue to be so grateful that you chose to keep my company. I hope that something I said was thought-provoking. Feel free to tell me what thoughts were provoked. Engage me in conversation. I'm kind of talking to myself here. But as I talk to myself, I hope that it will cause you to talk to yourself too. So until next time, remember that our ancestors maintained, preserved, and passed on our histories by word of mouth. So tell somebody about something you learned today. This has been Power to the Diaspora. Thank you so much for listening.